You think you know Little Red Riding Hood, a sweet girl in a red cloak, skipping through the forest with a basket of goodies for her sick grandmother. A big bad wolf who tricks her, eats the old woman, and nearly devours Red herself before a brave woodsman saves the day. It's the perfect children's story. Innocent, moral, with a clear lesson about stranger danger. But what if I told you that this innocent bedtime tale is actually one of the oldest and most disturbing stories ever passed down through human civilization? That beneath the sanitized Disney version lies a 3,000-year-old ritual. So dark, so sexually charged, and so deeply connected to ancient European paganism that early Christian missionaries spent centuries trying to erase it from human memory? Because buried beneath this children's story lies a secret that folklorists call the blood path. A coming-of-age ritual where young women walked alone into sacred forests, encountered wolf priests in animal masks, and emerged transformed from maidens into women through ceremonies that would shock modern audiences into silence. Welcome back, seekers of hidden truths. Tonight, we're going deep into the European forests where this story was born. Back to a time when the red cloak wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of menstrual blood, sexual awakening, and the ancient mysteries that governed life and death in the old religion. Once you discover what Little Red Riding Hood really represents, you'll understand why the Brothers Grimm tried so desperately to sanitize it, why Walt Disney turned it into harmless entertainment, and why certain versions of this tale are still kept locked away in folklore archives, too disturbing for public consumption. The girl in the red cloak wasn't walking to grandmother's house. She was walking toward her own sexual initiation, and the wolf wasn't trying to eat her. He was preparing to transform her into something entirely different. Before we descend into the ancient darkness of this tale, let's examine the versions you think you know, because each sanitized retelling reveals something about what earlier generations were trying to hide from their children and themselves. The story most people recognize today comes from the Brothers Grimm, published in 1812 as Rotkäppchen, in their collection of German folk tales. In their version, Little Red Riding Hood is an innocent child who disobeys her mother by straying from the forest path. The wolf tricks her into revealing her destination, races ahead to eat the grandmother, then disguises himself to deceive the girl. But just as the wolf is about to devour Red, a huntsman arrives, cuts open the wolf's belly, and rescues both the girl and her grandmother, who somehow survived being swallowed whole. It's a tidy moral tale about obedience, stranger danger, and the importance of staying on safe, approved paths. But the Grimm brothers weren't creating this story. They were desperately trying to make an ancient tale appropriate for German children in the early 1800s. Their version eliminated elements that would have horrified their Christian readers, while preserving just enough of the original to maintain the story's mysterious power. But the Grimms weren't the first to sanitize this tale. Charles Perrault, writing in France in 1697, published Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, with an even more brutal ending where no woodsman arrives to save the day. In Perrault's version, the wolf simply eats both the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood. End of story. His moral was explicitly stated. Young women who listen to strangers will end up devoured by wolves, both literal and metaphorical. Yet even Perrault's darker version was a sanitization of something far more disturbing. He transformed what had been an adult initiation story into a cautionary tale about sexual predators, changing the wolf from a sacred guide into a simple villain, and Red from an active participant in ritual transformation into a passive victim of male violence. The earliest written version we have comes from medieval manuscripts, where the story appears as the story of the grandmother in various forms across different European regions. In these versions, the girl isn't wearing red. She's wearing the natural colors of forest herbs and flowers. The grandmother isn't sick. She's described as the old wise woman of the woods. And most significantly, there's no rescue. The girl must save herself through cleverness, trickery, and knowledge of forest lore that suggests she's been trained for exactly this encounter. But even these medieval versions were already corrupted by Christian influence. Monks and scribes who recorded oral traditions couldn't bring themselves to preserve the full pagan context of what they were documenting. They changed sacred grove encounters into domestic visits, transformed ritual guides into threatening predators, and turned spiritual initiation into moral instruction about feminine virtue and masculine protection. Archaeological evidence from across Europe reveals that stories following the Red Riding Hood pattern appear in Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and Nordic traditions dating back thousands of years before any written versions. These weren't children's stories, but adult ceremonial narratives that were told during specific seasonal festivals, particularly those associated with the autumn harvest and the dark months when the boundary between the living world and the spirit realm grew thin. The consistent elements across all these ancient versions tell us something crucial about what this story originally meant. A young woman of marriageable age, a ritual journey into wild space, an encounter with a powerful animal spirit, and a transformation that marked her passage from one life stage to another. This wasn't entertainment. It was religious instruction for one of the most important transitions in human life. Understanding these sanitized versions is crucial, because each change reveals what successive generations found most threatening about the original story. The Grimms were horrified by the sexual implications. Perrault was disturbed by the girl's agency and power. Medieval Christians were terrified by the pagan religious context. And modern Disney adaptations are uncomfortable with any suggestion that growing up involves danger, transformation, or encounters with forces beyond parental control. To understand the true origins of Little Red Riding Hood, we must travel back to a time before Christianity, before written language, before the great forests of Europe were cleared for farmland and cities. We must journey into the world of our ancestors, where stories weren't entertainment, but sacred instructions for navigating the mysteries of life, death, and the dangerous transition between childhood and adulthood. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern and central Europe reveals a consistent pattern of ritual activity centered around forest clearings, stone circles, and sacred groves where communities gathered during specific lunar cycles to conduct ceremonies marking important life transitions. These weren't casual gatherings, but highly organized religious events that required months of preparation and involved the participation of specialized priest guides who had devoted their lives to understanding the ancient mysteries. The earliest archaeological traces of Red Riding Hood type rituals come from Bronze Age burial sites in what is now Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic, dating back approximately 3,500 years. Excavations have uncovered the remains of young women buried with distinctive red ochre staining on their clothing and skin, accompanied by wolf teeth, bear claws, and other predator symbols that suggest their participation in animal spirit ceremonies before their deaths. But these weren't sacrifice victims. The burial context suggests these women died natural deaths years or even decades after their ritual initiations, and were buried with the sacred symbols of their transformative experiences as marks of spiritual achievement. The red ochre, analysis reveals, wasn't random decoration, but carefully applied in patterns that mirror the mythological geography described in later oral versions of the Red Riding Hood story. Celtic druids, whose practices were documented by Roman observers before they were systematically suppressed by Christian missionaries, conducted elaborate seasonal ceremonies called the Red Path Rituals, where young women who had recently begun menstruating were guided through forest journeys designed to teach them about their new roles as potentially fertile members of the community. These rituals took place during the autumn months when the leaves turned red, and the natural world demonstrated the beauty and necessity of death and transformation. The young women wore red clothing, dyed with sacred herbs and iron-rich clay, symbolically connecting them to the blood of life that now flowed through their bodies, and the blood of sacrifice that maintained cosmic balance. The wolves in these ancient ceremonies weren't actual animals, but specially trained priest guides who wore elaborate wolf masks and costumes, embodying the spirit of the forest's most intelligent and socially sophisticated predator. Wolves were chosen as the central animal spirit because of their complex pack hierarchies, their role as both nurturers and hunters, and their legendary ability to move between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. Germanic tribes practiced similar ceremonies called Ulfhedna rituals, where young women encountered warrior priests who had undergone their own transformative ceremonies to become wolf warriors, men who had transcended normal human limitations through spiritual union with wolf spirits. These encounters weren't sexual in the crude modern sense, but were understood as sacred exchanges of spiritual energy that prepared both participants for their adult roles in the community. The grandmother's house in these original ceremonies wasn't a domestic dwelling, but a sacred structure built at the heart of the forest, usually constructed from living trees that had been shaped and grown specifically for ritual purposes over many years. These tree houses served as temples where the deepest mysteries of life and death were revealed to initiates who had proven themselves worthy through their courage in facing the wolf guides. Nordic sagas contain references to the Red Woman's Journey, describing elaborate ceremonies where young women spent 3 days and nights alone in the forest, guided only by animal spirits and their own inner wisdom, before emerging as full members of the adult community, with new names, new roles, and new understanding of their place in the cosmic order. The timing of these rituals was crucial, and followed astronomical cycles that modern science has confirmed were understood with remarkable precision by ancient European cultures. The ceremonies took place during specific lunar phases, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to be at its thinnest, allowing for the kind of transformative encounters that marked the transition from girlhood to womanhood. Archaeological analysis of ritual sites has revealed evidence of elaborate preparation processes that began months before the actual ceremonies. Young women underwent training in forest survival, plant identification, spiritual meditation, and sacred storytelling that prepared them not just for the ritual itself, but for their expanded roles as wisdom keepers and life givers in their communities. The transformation that occurred during these rituals wasn't metaphorical, but was understood as a literal spiritual metamorphosis that changed the participants' fundamental nature. The girl who entered the forest was believed to die during the encounter with the wolf spirit, and the woman who emerged was understood to be a new being with different capabilities, responsibilities, and spiritual connections. This explains why the early versions of the Red Riding Hood story feel so strange to modern readers. They preserve the narrative structure of genuine spiritual initiation rather than simple moral instruction. The encounters with the wolf weren't threats to be avoided, but necessary challenges to be faced. And the transformation that resulted wasn't a problem to be solved, but a sacred accomplishment to be celebrated. The ritual journey that became Little Red Riding Hood was not a single ceremony, but part of an elaborate system of female initiation that governed the transition from childhood to adult womanhood in pre-Christian European societies. Understanding these rituals requires us to abandon modern assumptions about childhood, sexuality, and the relationship between the human and natural worlds, and enter a mindset where spiritual transformation was considered as real and necessary as physical growth. The preparation for the Red Path ritual began when a girl experienced her first menstruation, an event that was celebrated rather than hidden, and marked the beginning of an intensive training period that could last for months or even years. During this time, the initiate learned not just practical skills like herbal medicine, food preservation, and textile production, but also the sacred knowledge that would allow her to navigate the spiritual challenges of adult womanhood. The training was conducted by groups of elder women who had themselves completed the Red Path ritual decades earlier and had devoted their lives to preserving and transmitting the ancient knowledge. These women, known in various European languages by titles that translate roughly as forest mothers or blood grandmothers, were the living repositories of cultural wisdom and spiritual practice that sustained their communities through the dangerous uncertainties of pre-modern life. The ritual training included instruction in what we would now call altered states of consciousness, achieved through combinations of fasting, rhythmic breathing, herbal preparations, and prolonged meditation in natural settings. These practices weren't recreational drug use, but sophisticated spiritual technologies designed to allow the initiate to perceive and interact with the non-physical aspects of reality that were considered essential for successful adult functioning. The young women learned to identify and prepare dozens of plants with medicinal, contraceptive, and psychoactive properties, knowledge that would make them valuable community resources and give them significant control over their own reproductive choices. This botanical education was inseparable from spiritual instruction, as each plant was understood to possess its own spirit that needed to be approached with proper respect and ritual protocol. Perhaps most importantly, the initiates learned the sacred stories that encoded the fundamental principles of their culture's understanding of life, death, sexuality, and the relationship between human beings and the natural world. These weren't entertainment, but educational tools that contained crucial information about how to navigate the psychological and spiritual challenges of adult life. The red cloak itself was a crucial element of the ritual, but not as simple clothing. The red dye was prepared through elaborate ceremonies involving specific plants gathered during particular lunar phases, and mixed with the initiate's own menstrual blood to create a garment that was understood to be magically connected to her life force and spiritual development. This cloak served as both protection and identification, marking the wearer as someone undergoing sacred transformation. The actual forest journey took place only after months or years of preparation, and followed routes that had been established and maintained for generations. These weren't random wanderings, but carefully planned spiritual expeditions that took the initiate through a series of increasingly challenging encounters, designed to test and develop her courage, wisdom, and spiritual strength. The wolf guides who awaited the initiates in the forest were not random predators, but highly trained spiritual specialists who had themselves undergone years of preparation for their role in these ceremonies. These men had typically completed their own initiation rituals that transformed them into living embodiments of wolf spirit, capable of serving as bridges between the human and animal worlds. The encounter between the initiate and the wolf guide involved complex exchanges of spiritual energy that modern observers might interpret as sexual, but were understood in their original context as sacred transmissions of life force and wisdom. These interactions were carefully regulated by ritual protocols that ensured the safety and spiritual benefit of all participants while achieving the transformative goals of the ceremony. The devouring that features prominently in later versions of the story was indeed part of the original ritual, but as a symbolic death and rebirth rather than literal consumption. The initiate underwent a psychological and spiritual dissolution of her childhood identity, experiencing a form of ego death that allowed for the emergence of her adult self with new capabilities and understanding. The grandmother figure in these rituals was often a real elder woman who served as the final guide in the initiation process, helping the transformed initiate integrate her new identity and understand her changed relationship to the community and the natural world. This grandmother was typically the most respected spiritual teacher in the region, someone whose own transformative experiences had qualified her to guide others through the sacred mysteries. The ritual concluded with the initiate's return to her community, but not as the child who had departed. She was now considered a full adult, with new responsibilities, new privileges, and new spiritual powers that made her a valuable resource for her people's survival and prosperity. The successful completion of the Red Path ritual marked the beginning of her eligibility for marriage, motherhood, and leadership roles within the community's spiritual and social hierarchy. These initiation rituals served crucial psychological and social functions that modern coming-of-age ceremonies completely failed to address. They provided clear markers for the transition to adult responsibilities, created strong bonds between women across generational lines, and ensured that essential cultural knowledge was preserved and transmitted to each new generation of adult women. Every element of the Little Red Riding Hood story carries layers of symbolic meaning that reveal the sophisticated spiritual psychology of the ancient cultures that created these initiation rituals. To understand the true power of this story, we must decode the symbolic language that our ancestors used to encode their deepest understanding of human nature, spiritual transformation, and the relationship between consciousness and the natural world. The red cloak is perhaps the most obvious but also the most complex symbol in the entire story. On the surface level, red represents blood, specifically the menstrual blood that marks a young woman's entry into potential fertility and adult sexuality. But the symbolic meaning goes far deeper than simple biological function. In ancient European spirituality, red was the color of life force itself, the sacred energy that animated all living things and connected individual consciousness to the cosmic patterns that governed existence. The preparation of the red dye involved specific plants that were harvested during particular lunar phases and processed according to ritual protocols that had been refined over thousands of years. The most common base was madder root, which produces a deep, lasting red color, and was believed to possess spiritual properties that enhanced the wearer's connection to earth energies and ancestral wisdom. The addition of the initiate's own menstrual blood wasn't primitive superstition, but a sophisticated understanding of what we would now call psychosomatic medicine, the creation of a garment that was energetically attuned to the wearer's biological and spiritual rhythms. The forest itself represents the unconscious mind, the vast realm of human psychology that exists below the threshold of ordinary awareness, but contains the deepest sources of wisdom, creativity, and spiritual power. The journey into the forest is thus a journey into the depths of the psyche, where the initiate must confront aspects of herself and reality that cannot be accessed through ordinary conscious experience. The path through the forest is symbolic of the choices that determine spiritual development. In the original versions of the story, there are typically multiple paths available, representing different approaches to life and different possible outcomes for the initiate's development. The instruction to stay on the designated path represents the guidance provided by traditional wisdom, while the temptation to wander represents the dangers and opportunities of independent exploration. The wolf is perhaps the most complex symbol in the entire story, representing multiple aspects of the transformative process simultaneously. On one level, the wolf represents the wild, untamed aspects of nature that exist outside human social control, but are essential for psychological and spiritual health. Wolves were chosen as the central symbol because of their sophisticated social organization, their role as both nurturers and predators, and their legendary ability to move between different worlds and states of consciousness. But the wolf also represents the animus, the masculine aspect of the female psyche that must be integrated for complete psychological development. The encounter with the wolf guide allows the initiate to explore and incorporate masculine energies and perspectives without abandoning her feminine identity. This integration is essential for the kind of psychological wholeness that enables effective adult functioning in a world that requires both masculine and feminine capabilities. The grandmother represents the wise elder aspect of the feminine psyche, the part of the woman that understands the deepest mysteries of life and death, and can provide guidance during times of transformation and challenge. The grandmother's house in the heart of the forest represents the sanctuary of inner wisdom that can only be accessed after the initiate has proven her courage and commitment by facing the challenges of the wolf encounter. The act of devouring that features prominently in the story represents the dissolution of ego boundaries that is necessary for genuine spiritual transformation. The initiate must allow her childhood identity to be symbolically consumed so that her adult self can emerge with new capabilities and understanding. This process of ego death and rebirth is found in initiation ceremonies across cultures and represents one of the most fundamental patterns of human psychological development. The huntsman or woodsman, who appears in some versions, represents the protective masculine principle that can provide safety and guidance during the vulnerable phases of transformation. However, his presence is often a later addition to the story, reflecting patriarchal society's discomfort with tales of feminine spiritual autonomy and their need to insert masculine authority figures as sources of salvation and protection. The basket of food that Red carries to her grandmother represents the offerings that must be made to the spiritual forces that govern transformation. These weren't random gifts, but carefully selected items that had specific symbolic and energetic properties designed to facilitate the ritual process and honor the spiritual entities that were being invoked for guidance and protection. The timing of the story, typically set during autumn, when the natural world demonstrates the beauty and necessity of death and transformation, reflects the ancient understanding that human psychological development follows natural cycles, and that the most profound transformations occur during periods that mirror the larger patterns of cosmic change. The repetitive questioning between Red and the wolf, what big eyes you have, what big teeth you have, represents the gradual revelation of hidden truths that occurs during genuine spiritual initiation. Each question and answer brings the initiate closer to understanding the true nature of the transformative forces she is encountering, while also testing her courage and commitment to continue the process despite its increasingly intense and potentially frightening revelations. The bed where the final encounter takes place represents the liminal space between conscious and unconscious awareness, the threshold state where the most profound psychological and spiritual transformations occur. This isn't sexual symbolism in the crude modern sense, but recognition that the deepest forms of spiritual communion require the kind of vulnerable intimacy that allows for complete transformation of identity and consciousness. Understanding these symbolic meanings reveals that Little Red Riding Hood is not a simple story, but a sophisticated psychological and spiritual teaching tool that encoded thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about human development, transformation, and the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic forces that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover and understand. The transformation of Little Red Riding Hood from a sacred initiation narrative into a children's bedtime story represents one of the most successful campaigns of cultural suppression in European history. Understanding how and why this transformation occurred reveals the deep tensions between pagan spiritual traditions and the Christian worldview that gradually replaced them, as well as the modern discomfort with authentic spiritual experience that continues to shape how we understand human development and the relationship between consciousness and the natural world. The first phase of this transformation began with the systematic suppression of pagan religious practices by early Christian missionaries and political authorities. As Christianity spread throughout Europe between the 4th and 10th centuries AD, church leaders recognized that direct prohibition of ancient customs often led to rebellion and resistance. Instead, they developed sophisticated strategies for gradually modifying pagan traditions until their original spiritual content was eliminated, while maintaining familiar narrative structures that people could accept. The Red Path initiation rituals were particularly threatening to Christian authorities because they represented a form of spiritual education and transformation that operated entirely outside church control. These ceremonies created strong bonds between women across generational lines, preserved knowledge systems that competed with Christian doctrine, and provided young women with a sense of spiritual autonomy and power that was incompatible with the subordinate roles that Christianity assigned to females. Medieval Christian scholars developed elaborate theological arguments for why these initiation rituals were not just misguided, but actively demonic. They argued that the wolf guides were literal demons in animal form, that the forest encounters involved sexual congress with supernatural evil forces, and that the transformative experiences reported by initiates were actually forms of demonic possession that endangered both individual souls and the Christian community as a whole. These theological interpretations weren't just academic exercises, but provided justification for increasingly harsh persecution of anyone who participated in or facilitated traditional initiation ceremonies. The Inquisition specifically targeted wise women who preserved ancient knowledge, torturing and executing thousands of elderly females whose primary crime was maintaining the traditional spiritual practices that had sustained European communities for millennia. But complete suppression proved impossible, because the narrative patterns encoded in these stories met fundamental psychological needs that Christian doctrine couldn't adequately address. People continued to tell versions of the Red Riding Hood story, but gradually modified them to conform to Christian moral frameworks and avoid persecution by religious authorities. The first major modification was the transformation of the wolf guide from a sacred spiritual teacher into a demonic predator. This change served multiple purposes for Christian editors. It eliminated the positive spiritual content of the wolf encounter, while providing a clear symbol of evil that reinforced Christian teachings about the dangers of venturing outside approved religious authority. The second crucial change was the elimination of the initiate's active participation in her own transformation. In the original versions, the young woman sought out the forest encounter and participated willingly in the transformative process. Christian versions gradually transformed her into a passive victim who stumbled into danger through disobedience and required rescue by masculine authority figures representing proper Christian order. The third major modification was the domestication of the setting from sacred forest space to ordinary household visits. This change eliminated the spiritual geography that was essential to the original story's meaning, while creating a more familiar context that reinforced Christian values about family structure and feminine roles. The Protestant Reformation intensified these modifications, as Reformed Christianity became even more hostile to anything that suggested spiritual authority outside official church doctrine. Protestant scholars systematically removed remaining traces of ritual content from folk tales while emphasizing moral instruction that supported their theological perspectives about sin, obedience, and salvation. The Brothers Grimm represented the culmination of this Christian sanitization process. Their version eliminated virtually all traces of the original spiritual content, while creating a coherent moral narrative that German parents could comfortably share with their children. They transformed a complex initiation story into simple instruction about stranger danger and the importance of obedience to parental authority. The Industrial Age brought additional modifications as urbanization separated people from the natural world and made the forest settings of traditional stories seem increasingly foreign and frightening, rather than sacred and transformative. Urban parents who had no experience with actual forests or wild animals could only understand these settings as sources of danger rather than spiritual opportunity. Modern mass media completed the transformation by creating sanitized versions that removed even the mild dangers present in 19th century versions. Disney's approach represents the ultimate domestication of ancient spiritual wisdom into harmless entertainment that poses no challenge to contemporary values or assumptions about human development and spiritual possibility. The psychological cost of this transformation has been enormous. Modern young women reach biological maturity without any culturally supported process for understanding or celebrating their transition to adult sexuality and spiritual responsibility. The absence of meaningful initiation leaves many people psychologically unprepared for adult challenges and unable to access the deeper sources of wisdom and strength that the ancient ceremonies were designed to activate. Contemporary interest in goddess spirituality, wilderness therapy, and alternative approaches to female development represents an unconscious attempt to recover what was lost when these ancient initiation traditions were suppressed. But without understanding the sophisticated spiritual psychology that guided the original ceremonies, modern efforts often lack the depth and effectiveness of their ancient predecessors. The survival of Little Red Riding Hood in any form represents the remarkable tenacity of human wisdom and the inability of even the most systematic cultural suppression to completely eliminate stories that encode essential truths about human nature and spiritual development. Despite centuries of modification and sanitization, the core narrative patterns continue to resonate with readers who sense that something profound lies beneath the surface of this seemingly simple tale. Recovering the true story of Little Red Riding Hood requires us to move beyond the sanitized versions that dominate contemporary culture and reconnect with the ancient understanding of human development as a spiritual process that requires courage, wisdom, and the willingness to face transformative challenges that cannot be avoided or domesticated without losing their essential power to create genuine psychological and spiritual growth.